Social justice and education. That's the title of our first panel of the day, a pressing issue that most schools across the globe are trying to find solutions to, where students can thrive in an environment through increased empathy, justice, and equality, regardless of their socioeconomic background. Students who are taught within this framework will ideally have a stronger sense of what's just and fair, and choose careers and lifestyles that support their communities. I'd like to now introduce our panel. Moderating the session is Professor Dr. Macit Ayhan Melikoğlu at the Department of Educational Sciences at Boğaziçi University. Joining Professor Melikoğlu are Dr. Felal Ahmar. She's a visiting research fellow at the Open University in the UK. Welcome. Professor Kerry John Kennedy is also with us today. He's an advisor for academic development and part of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the Education University of Hong Kong. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to also welcome Professor Robert Jenkins with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's also the former Director of Education and Adolescent Development at UNICEF. Mr. Melikoğlu, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Han. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night for everyone from all over the world. Dear participants and distinguished panelists, I would like to welcome all of you to the second panel of the summit. And the title of this panel is Social Justice and Education. We will have three distinguished speakers in this panel. I would like to start with my short presentation about the topic first, and I will leave the floor for our panelists. When we talk about the education, the first thing that comes to mind is the new generation and the society. In many countries, it's considered critical for the permanence of the state. In many countries, education is seen as the essential for the state to survive and thrive. And there are still debates about how education, which is considered to be one of the most important elements in the shaping of the future of countries, should be provided and how everyone should have access to education. Indeed, education, also defined as the process of humanizing people, has a chance of achieving this goal as long as it proceeds with a focus on social justice. Social justice encompasses a broad and adaptable idea focused on treating people from different socioeconomic backgrounds in a fair and equitable manner. Social justice and fairness are closely related and often interchangeable. Fairness involves empowering people and addressing systematic inequities related to race, class, gender, and special needs. Emphasizing the importance of taking action to create change, social justice is seen as a dynamic action. It emphasizes a shared distribution of benefits and responsibilities and the interdependence of individuals and their communities. Diversity, another important concept in the context of social justice, is the variety of personal differences and similarities influenced by inherent characteristics, life experiences, and choices. Diversity encompasses gender, age, ethnicity, racial, cultural, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, personality, marital status, religious affiliation, and family roles. Inclusion means establishing an environment that values diversity. It's an environment that recognizes and supports everyone. Differences are seen as strengths rather than barriers in a diverse workplace. the 1993 Education Act and the 1994 Salamanca World Conference on Special Education were key milestones in promoting education by advocating equality and recognizing the importance of diversity. Linked to the belief that education is a fundamental human right for all, inclusion is an ongoing process that requires constant adaptation to the diverse needs of learners. Through their advocacy of equitable practices, educators have a critical role to play in the creation of an inclusive education environment beyond the walls of school. Inclusive education aims to eliminate social exclusion resulting from how the diversity of race, class, ethnicity, religion, gender, and ability is perceived and responded to. It starts with the belief that education is a fundamental human right and the foundation for a more equitable society. Agencies such as the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Turkish Maarif Foundation are addressing global education challenges with a focus on gender equality, inclusive learning, and comprehensive development. Inclusive education refers to having all children in the same classroom and the same schools, provided that support is available at all times for both the students and the teachers. It means providing real opportunities to learn for groups that have historically been marginalized, including not only children with disabilities, but also students facing multiple barriers to accessing education. Another key term is universal design for learning. Borrowed from the architecture, UDL is a strategy for removing barriers to learning. In order to foster an inclusive atmosphere, it includes universal design instruction, curriculum, and assessment. Inclusive education emphasizes the importance of fostering collaboration among those involved in education to create an environment that supports the holistic development of each student. This forward-thinking approach differs from the traditional streaming and banding approach, which often resulted in segregated and isolated environments. This approach emphasizes collective responsibility and shared leadership in public administration and promotes transition from hierarchic frameworks to more collaborative approaches. Inclusive education is a fundamental idea that emphasizes the importance of providing equitable access to quality education for every student, regardless of their background. Teachers provides inclusive education strongly, teachers' perspective actually on inclusive education strongly influence its outcomes, and attitudes have a powerful influence on day-to-day behavior. Supportive school staff attitudes are critical to successful inclusion. In contrast, negative attitudes are an obstacle to progress in the inclusion of students with special needs. A troubling lack of preparedness for inclusive education is evident in teachers' attitudes, which often stem from inadequate training. Educators are enthusiastic but insecure due to a lack of training. In order to close the gap in knowledge and confidence, in-service training appears to be an important tool. And educators' willingness to use inclusive methods correspond with their views on inclusion. The importance of thorough and relevant training is highlighted as knowledge has a strong influence on these attitudes. Since perceptions are closely related to both knowledge and experience, pre-service training emerges as an essential tool in this context. In addition, a positive change in attitudes can be achieved through the provision of support services and the creation of inclusive environment with accessible facilities. Educators need a range of resources to meet different learning needs in order to successfully implement inclusive teaching methods. The impact of positive teacher attitudes in promoting an inclusive approach is reinforced by the understanding that students often reflect the attitudes of their teachers. So in order to promote inclusive education, teacher preparation is essential. Individuals need to become familiar with different models of inclusive education. Tailored instruction techniques and materials should be in place for students with special needs. The availability of customized resources and individualized education plan is essential to ensure the success of inclusion. Making inclusive education a reality requires that educators modify their curricula and collaborate to make it work. This approach ensures that every student, regardless of his or her ability, receives the support and opportunities he or she needs to succeed in an inclusive learning environment. So in mainstream schools, educators face complex challenges, balancing the dual responsibilities of providing quality education and ensuring each student's safety. These responsibilities are even more complex for educators who work with students with special needs. Their obligations are even more demanding. Central to these challenges is the educators' need to carefully balance maintaining discipline, encouraging patience, developing individual talents, and fostering an inclusive and equitable learning environment. Implementing socially just practices in the classroom is a key approach to addressing these challenges. Rather than viewing the classroom as a homogeneous whole, this means recognizing and responding to the unique needs of each student. This approach recognizes that learners have a wide variety of educational needs, characteristics, preferences, abilities, and learning rates. Through the use of an individualized and flexible teaching methods, teachers can successfully reduce the learning challenges that students may face, thus promoting a more inclusive education environment. Nevertheless, achieving inclusive education goals and implementing social justice practices are challenging. Despite dedicated initiatives and impact that initiative and a variety of approaches, inclusive education has not yet reached the level of effectiveness and impact that was expected. This indicates that despite progress, a gap remains between the expected potential of inclusive education and its current implementation and outcomes. The acquisition of field experience and training is essential for effective problem solving. In addition, theory and practice can be linked through collaboration between schools and universities. Interaction among teachers can be facilitated collaboration through online collaboration platforms. Educators need to model inclusive practices. Addressing different elements of teacher training, such as behavioral management and legal issues, is critical. Collaborating with pre-service and practicing teachers enhances inclusive education. Therefore, inclusive teachers training should go beyond and theoretical and into the practical. To ensure social justice, that inclusive education practices benefit all students, it's important that all stakeholders in the education system and all segments of society, in addition to teachers, adopt and support inclusive approaches, as well as inclusive education practices. So now it's time to listen to our panelists. Let's review the topics for their speeches and discussion questions. The first topic that we will cover today is equity in access and opportunities. And we have four discussion questions about this topic. The first question is, what are the most significant barriers to equitable access to education today, and how can we address them effectively? The second discussion question is, what strategies have you found most effective in fostering inclusive education and ensuring equal opportunities for students from diverse backgrounds? The third one is, how can scholarships and financial aid programs be better designed to promote long-term equity rather than just short-term access to education? And the last question for this topic is, the opportunity gap has been discussed for a long time, and what kind of concrete steps to fulfill equity? Another topic that we will cover today is the curriculum and pedagogical practices. And we have three questions, discussion question for that. How can educators effectively integrate social justice themes into the curriculum without compromising academic standards? The second question is, what are some examples of culturally responsive teaching practices that have successfully enhanced student engagement and learning outcomes? And the third question is, how can school foster an environment that promotes critical thinking and social awareness in students, encouraging them to address societal issues both inside and outside the classroom? And the last topic that we will cover today is policy and community engagement. And we have three discussion questions for that topic as well. The first one is, what are the key elements of educational policies that successfully promote social justice, and how can they be effectively implemented across diverse school systems? The second question is, how can schools better engage families and communities in supporting social justice education? And the last question is, what are some successful examples of collaborative efforts between schools, communities, and policymakers to create more just and equitable learning environment? And let's learn about more about our speakers. These are all great topics and discussion questions that we will cover, that will be covered by our panelists. And we have three panels, as I mentioned in the beginning. The first speakers that we will be having is Kerry John Kennedy. Professor Kerry Kennedy is currently chair professor and advisor at the Education University of Hong Kong, where he works in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. He is also a distinguished visiting professor of curriculum studies in the Education of Education at the in the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg. Welcome, Dr. Kennedy. And the other speaker that we will have today is Robert Jenkins. Robert Jenkins is a lecturer at Harvard University, brings over 30 years of experience in international development and humanitarian programming in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Dr. Jenkins served as a Global Director of Education and Adolescent Development for UNICEF from 2019 to 2024. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins. And the last speakers that we will have today will be Fela Lahmar. Dr. Fela Lahmar is a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a recognition of her leadership competence in UK higher education. With over 20 years of expertise in Islamic and comparative education, she is strongly committed to social justice and decolonization. And welcome, Dr. Lahmar. And we will start with Dr. Kerry John Kennedy with his speech. And it's your stage is yours, Dr. Kennedy. We are eager to listen to your speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today at a very important conference, considering what is perhaps one of the most significant topics globally, particularly in relation to the sustainable development goals. What I'm going to talk about today is not so much school, but post-school options, because there is little use producing students. Universities they go to do not follow up on that. And the focus is going to be particularly in an Asian context, and that's because that's where I work, but also because I want to stress that this is about context rather than about trying to make some generalizations across contexts. What I'm going to report is a research project, and we're grateful for the funding provided by our university. But of course, our views are not the views of the university, they are our personal views. I want to start with just this brief description of what we're going to do. We'll look at some background and perspective, objectives, briefly at methodology, and spend most of the time on the results and the conclusions that we've reached, keeping in mind that this project is only part way through and it hasn't yet finished. Just as a preliminary, we heard from the speaker some definitions of diversity and inclusion. So let me share what we started with. We're going from this is where we started. Is diversity in the mind the way
I think with a connection problem with Dr. Kennedy. I think there's a technical problem with that. So when people are working on this issue, we can wait for, okay, we get the connection back, I guess.
My apology.
No problem.
Can we continue?
Sure, and you can share your presentation again.
So let me give you some background. Be clear that the United States, which is often considered to be the home of diversity, equity, and inclusion, although that may not be necessarily correct, where we see a considerable withdrawal of support for
Kennedy,
diversity,
we are not seeing
equity,
the
and
presentation.
inclusion.
Can you share the presentation with us? Sorry.
Okay.
We don't see the presentation on the screen.
Let me go back to here. Is that better now?
No, it's not on the screen. Did you hit the share button?
So our view was that there is withdrawal of support for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States. But that's something we're not going to comment on here today. But nevertheless, what this means is that when diversity, equity, and inclusion are dependent on legal and judicial decisions, there is always a danger that once those decisions are changed, then diversity and equity are under some threat. And that's an issue we think which is important and that we would like to explore in this presentation. That is, how do we proceed once the law no longer supports us, which is the United States situation. And so we decided we'd have a look at our own region, that is Asia, where DEI has not been embedded in legislative mandates as it was in the United States. Institutions where more and more students are going. Universities are no longer a leading institution institutions. And we wanted to see what we could identify as DI. And so our key question was, in a more deregulated environment than the United States, what kind of initiatives have emerged and what lessons are there for the future? Um, we'll quickly go through a better idea of what it is that AI presents in the Asian context, or at least in the context of Asian universities. We did a very extensive literature review, trying to understand what was out there and what people were writing about. We looked at documents that were available, but we would have to say that, and this research is typical, most of that documentation is on the university website rather than in hard copy. And we tried really looking for was a framework for understanding DI in Asian higher education. We wanted to see how equity, diversity, and inclusion were a part of the way universities in the region saw their role, and therefore to try and understand what might be a rationale for these initiatives. So what did we find? Well, we could not identify what we would call any integrated structures committed to DI as a whole. That is, if we compare this with the United States, there are offices usually called diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. They put these three areas together, and that becomes the work of a group of people within the university, or it did until processes were put in place to try and withdraw it. But we did not find that in Asia, in the Asian universities that we looked at. We found that there were some public commitments that were quite different across countries. So in Hong Kong, most universities will have an equal opportunities office. These offices are largely constructed to respond to the legal requirements about equal opportunities for gender, equal opportunities for ethnic minorities, equal opportunities for students with special needs. In Korea, we found that most universities, and the Korea University was a good example, had diversity councils, which were responsible for monitoring diversity. Again, didn't have that broad brief of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so our first finding, therefore, is that we need to look at the separate components of DEI. They don't always go together, as we found with the number of universities that we looked at. So that's the first point that we wanted to make. That led us to review somewhat our approach and definition of the main terms. We wanted to redefine equity to be ensuring that there is concern with fairness and that the education of all learners is seen as having equal importance. This actually comes from UNESCO. And we thought it worth integrating the UNESCO definitions with the original Gubernarat definitions that we worked with. We also wanted to better understand diversity. As you show here, we see it as race, ethnicity, gender, language, culture, physical ability, etc. There are many equity groups, and we need to understand what these groups are and what their special needs are. So while it's good to say that diversity is about difference, our understanding here is that it is about difference, but very specific kinds of differences, which we need to better understand. And inclusion as a process that helps overcome barriers that are really related to participation and achievement. There ought to be nothing in a university that stops people from participating, no matter what it is. Inclusion ought to be a very broad process. So that's what came out of our first look at some of the universities. But let me look a little deeper now, because I don't want to suggest certainly my colleagues don't want to suggest that that's all that happens. In some universities, equity is a really important concern, especially in relation to admission to universities. So you have the example in Vietnam of different admission scores for regional students. That is some recognition that regional students have barriers that prevent them from performing in the same way as perhaps their urban counterparts, and so they are given extra scores. Now that is the way we have defined equity. We find exactly the same in China, where preferential policies are in place for ethnic minority students, and they too get better scores that help them to enter university. And in India, 27% of university places are reserved for what are called other backward classes, which are classes affected by the old system of caste, which has been historically part of India. So these special provisions for equity, we think, are worth highlighting because it suggests that while there's no integrated policy, that there are policies around some of the really key areas. Yet we also find that there are some groups that don't receive attention that they ought to do. For example, in Hong Kong, the disparity between ethnic minority students and Chinese students in terms of percentage represented within universities is really significant. And at the moment, there is no policy that supports ethnic minority students, and the idea of giving them extra scores is something that would not be considered. So if you compare across, you see there are differences as well as similarities. And in terms of gender equity, there is the old problem that's not just an Asian problem of participation in particular university courses. Women tend to do nursing and teaching, feminized professions, and you find that in the universities. Engineering does not seem to be a profession that all women can participate in. So there are some barriers to participation, which we think are very important to understand. So we can't make generalizations about equity, but those examples give you some idea of where the region is heading. Inclusion doesn't seem to be a strong value within the Asian context, yet there are some interesting examples. So there's a tradition of women's universities in Asia. Many countries, as you can see there, have universities dedicated to women, and some writers see this as an issue of gender empowerment. That is, of a welcoming environment on universities that makes sure that those who are there feel included and a part of the university. We find that students with special needs in universities, this is a big concern we know in schools, and how we work out how to provide for these students. We don't find any detailed policy formulation across the universities that we looked at. We know that in Malaysia there are disability support officers that do try to provide support, but we don't find the policies that might do this. And in this Sri Lankan example as well, is that universities continue to cope with problems that have been around for a very long time about, for example, treating ethnic minority students in the context of Sri Lanka. But again, no direct approach to this or how it should be done. One of the areas we did try to look at very closely was diversity and learning. And this was mentioned in the first presentation as well in schools, and it goes on in universities as well. We understand that some students need better ways of, or different ways of learning. We found some examples of the use of AI and how this was helpful, but of course there are then some problems with access to AI and who has it and who doesn't have it. We found, interestingly, international students who weren't initially included in our study, but increasingly are becoming part of how learning has to be designed for multiple students from different backgrounds and different learning backgrounds. What we find in Asian universities is there are some initiatives, but they don't always focus on the needs of all students, or even recognizing that there are differences between students. And we think that's a really important point. And just on this point quickly, online education, we think, is very important and is something that we could do much more work on, because it has the capacity to cater for individual differences in ways that more traditional student teaching doesn't do that. So trying to sum up now, the point we want to make, and it's a tentative point, and it's probably a controversial point. In the United States, diversity, equity, inclusion comes out of democratic values and principles. We're starting to think that in the Asian context, neoliberalism is a greater push for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I think we had that. Okay.
Because universities are becoming those places where most students will go, we think this is an important point, that in Asian context, they will probably go there because this is where they get skilled. And that's why it's important to cater for all students and not just some students. We have some conclusions. We think the main conclusion for the future is about context and policy making, and also including international students as a part of the mix in terms of diversity, not just students coming from different national backgrounds. Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry for the interruptions that kept taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, Dr. Kennedy. It was great to hear that the diversity, equity, the developments in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Asian context, and it was great to listen to from your presentation. And we have the second presenter, Fellow Lahmar, and it's your, the floor is yours, Dr. Lahmar.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to be with all you today. It's my introduction at the beginning with the Open University. Yes, I was with the Open University very recently, just completed my work and moving to Hamad bin Khalifa University very shortly. The views here are mine, are not neither for the Open University nor for Hamad bin Khalifa University. So talking today about the beyond barriers, transforming educational practices and policies for decolonial equity, it is a profound honor to stand before you today to discuss this issue that lies at the heart of education and humanity, the intersection of equity, ethical responsibility, and the urgent need to decolonize our educational systems. Education, as we know it, is far more than the transmission of knowledge or accumulation of skills. It is a force that shapes identities, defines cultures, and determines futures. However, for many, education has also been a tool of exclusion, domination, and erasure. Today, I want us to reflect on how we can reclaim education as a site of liberation, one that dismantles colonial legacies and fosters equity for all. So in doing so, I want to address a stark contradiction in our global educational landscape. While global metrics and rankings celebrate innovation and progress, the ethical consequences of their frameworks are often ignored. However, in this contradiction, nowhere is more evident than in Gaza. Education there is an act of survival, resilience, defiance against systems that seek to erase identities and futures. Yet institutions complicit in enabling this erasure, like Technion Institute, for example, are ranked and celebrated by the very metrics that ignore the extensive destruction they help cause in Gaza. Global education metrics like PISA, the International Students Assessment, and the Times Higher Education frame success through a Eurocentric, market-driven lens. So institutions are rewarded for measurable outputs, citations, research funding, and technological advancements without serious evaluation of the ethical implications of these outcomes. For example, the Technion Israel Institute of Technology ranks highly in the Times Higher Education, promoting its reputation as renowned for research, while Technion technological advancements are globally acclaimed. These innovations directly contribute to military operations in Gaza, facilitating the colonization, destruction of lives, erasure of heritage, and devastation of educational infrastructure. So that's raised many issues. For example, Alan Aziz, the CEO of Technion UK, openly states that Technion has played a unique and extraordinary role in the development of the State of Israel and the startup nation. Israel relies on Technion science for its defense. By contrast, Gaza's universities are excluded from these rankings. Gaza's education system is a symbol of cultural resilience, remains invisible in these rankings. UN experts have condemned Israel's deliberate targeting of Gaza's education system. And as a scholars decide, by April 2024, just to remind, 80% of Gaza's schools and 60% of educational facilities were destroyed. 625,000 students were left without access to education. Gaza's last remaining university, Isra University, was demolished, along with its central archives containing 150 years of history. While Gaza's educational institutions are obliterated, Technion received global acclaim for research outputs that directly facilitate such destruction. This dichotomy highlights the failure of current global education systems to prioritize equity and ethical accountability. And we take it there to Israel's membership in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, a body that professes the champion of better lives, further exemplifies this dissonance. The OECD's Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, which is many schools follow, focuses on preparing students for real-life challenges, framing education as a tool for economic productivity. This frame aligns with the OECD's origins as the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, created to administer Marshall Plan aid after the Second World War, reinforcing its foundational alignment with Western economic dominance. The OECD Directorate for Education and Skills assertion of fostering values that drive better jobs and better lives raises critical questions. Which values are being promoted and who determines their legitimacy? Better lives in what ways? Based on whose criteria, worldview, and priorities? The OECD targeted reforms aimed for citizens to develop the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values they need throughout their lives. However, this prompts further inquiry, which ontological, epistemological, and ethical frameworks underpin these reforms, which attitudes are deemed necessary and by whom. Despite Israel's well-documented breaches of international law, the OECD accepted its membership in 2010, which raises serious questions about the organization's values and ethical integrity in evaluating or reforming other nations' education systems. In 2024, the appointment of Ambassador Shay Cohen as Israel's OECD underscores this dissonance. Cohen's background in defense diplomacy symbolizes how some global platforms normalize systemic oppression and colonialism. I'm talking here at the heart of the Gaza's, which is described by many scholars as genocide. That is in September 2024. The OECD's rhetoric of better life, of a better life, becomes deeply troubling when juxtaposed with its member state, Israel's atrocities in Gaza. According to a UN report, by the 1st of October 2024, the death toll in Gaza approached 42,000, with injuries nearing 96,000, although these figures likely understate the scale of the devastation. At least 13,000 children, including over 700 babies, have been killed, many deliberately targeted by sniper fires to the head and chest. Over 1 million Palestinian children now require mental health support. These atrocities are live-streamed, arguably genocide and scholasticide committed by an OECD member state, Israel. Given this background, we ask again, what legitimacy does the OECD's International Student Assessment, PISA, hold in evaluating education when one of its members engages in such atrocities? What values does the OECD stand for, and how are these demonstrated in practice? In this context, what does the OECD's aim of a better life means? Better for whom? Defined by what metrics and at what human cost? So this takes us further to just reflect on colonialism, and that is still embedded in some global educational organizations that are influencing education globally across countries, colonized countries. The enduring legacy of colonialism and of colonial education, as critiqued by Frantz Fanon and Malik Ben Nabi, highlights its role in fostering psychological alienation and post-colonial dependency. Fanon revealed how colonial systems disconnected the colonized from their roots, instilling inferiority and privileging Western epistemologies. Ben Nabi expanded this critique, emphasizing that overcoming dependency requires cultivating civilizational attitudes, intellectual and ethical capacities that enable societies to define their futures with dignity and self-determination. To address this, post-colonial nations must develop educational systems rooted in indigenous knowledge, ethical values, and critical independence. In here, Shenturk's civilizational approach of multiplexity bridges this effort, advocating for a balance between preserving cultural authenticity and engaging with global interconnectedness. Reimagining education as a multiplex ethical endeavor helps dismantle oppressive colonial structures while fostering pathways to nurture and protect human compassion and dignity in a pluralistic, rapidly evolving world. So I'm talking here about reimagining ethical education. To reclaim education as a force for liberation, we must address the ethical failures embedded in global rankings, collaborations, and practices, which requires a shift in focus for both policymakers and practitioners. Here are some critical recommendations. Policymakers should prioritize dismantling colonial legacies by upholding indigenous knowledge systems and affirming cultural identities. Educational institutions must embed ethical accountability into global collaboration and knowledge production. Teachers should engage critically in curricula and pedagogy, fostering identities aligned with local traditions while adapting to global challenges. Prioritize funding and policies supporting educational equity in marginalized communities, ensuring resilience amidst systemic inequities. Advocates for accountability in international organizations, for example, OECD, to uphold human rights over economic priorities. So what is the vision for the future? I imagine an ethical education. As educators, researchers, and policymakers, we face choices. Sustain systems that maintain inequity or transform education into a tool for justice and dignity. Let me close with the powerful words of South Africa's Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Israeli universities are in an intimate part of the Israeli regime by active choice. While Palestinians are not able to access universities and schools, Israeli universities produce the research, technology, arguments, and leaders for maintaining the occupation. So Tutu here reminds us that neutrality in education is a myth. Every education we make, or every decision, we make either sustains oppression or foster liberation and equity. Let us then commit to the latter and reimagine education as an ethical endeavor for humanity. Together, we can ensure that education truly serves humanity, not just a privileged few. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for your speech, Dr. Lahmar. It was great to listen to you, and your topic is very important in this current situation in Gaza and Israel. So thank you very much for the speech. And it's turn for Dr. Jenkins, Robert Jenkins, and Dr. Jenkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. As per the other speakers, the views I'm about to share are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the university I'm currently associated with, nor my previous employers. But I do appreciate this opportunity, and I'm going to be sharing reflections on the important relationship between education and social justice, taking a global view and focusing on specifically on basic education. Again, thank you very much to the organizers for organizing this discussion on education and social justice. And let me begin by building on the opening presentation of Professor and Dr. Melagoglu that did define social justice. And I would like to also just confirm that what I would like to define as social justice is to look at the equal realization, enjoyment of rights and opportunities to education. And the link between education and social justice, as I think as all will recognize, is integral. And education has an incredible potential to influence and promote the level of social justice in any country and globally. And also, we all recognize that schools play an absolutely critical role in promoting social justice. And think there are three key elements at a school level that influence the relationship between education and social justice. And that is the level of access to education, which I'm going to talk a lot more about using some global statistics, the content of what is taught, and that is the what, but also in how it is being taught, the pedagogy. So those three elements I'd like to propose are important when looking at the relationship between education and social justice. And in a sense, they influence the relationship, the potential that education has on influencing social justice. Also, I think all would recognize that importance that education has in not only in, as you mentioned at the opening statements, Dr. Melek Okoglu, on that education can also link very much to other human rights beyond education, recognizing education as a human right of all children, but also in the realization of the right to education links to other human rights, including the right to health, the right to protection, and others. So I think we should see social education as a springboard for social justice, and look at those three elements of the school. I'd like to kind of propose that education also can serve as a catalyst or a springboard, as I mentioned before, in promoting social justice within a society and globally. It has the potential to empower individuals and communities, as was mentioned in the opening presentation. It can enables the acquisition of skills to access employment and realize each child's potential, and ultimately to break the cycle of poverty. It can promote social cohesion through the promotion of certain principles of inclusiveness, as you mentioned also, Dr. Melek Okoglu. And there is obviously a direct correlation, as you mentioned also at the opening, of the level of support to teachers. You mentioned in-service training and other forms of support to enable teachers to promote inclusiveness and in a sense realize education as a catalyst for social justice and positive social change. Let me highlight some of the current challenges globally that we see across many countries in this realizing education as an enabler for promoting social cohesion and social justice. There are, as you mentioned in the opening presentation, certain levels of barriers that to access that children face around the world that often correlate to their socioeconomic status or where they live within a country or their gender and the language they speak. And children with disabilities are often marginalized in many or all countries in levels of access and the potential to realize their reach learning outcomes. There are also recognition that in many countries, not all countries, schools in different areas often have very different levels of funding, also the quality of the facilities and the quality of the teaching and availability of teaching staff. And I earlier mentioned the what and the how, what is taught, the content, and also the pedagogy. It's also critically important. We recognize in some countries the curriculum lacks the representation and inclusivity of certain marginalized groups, something you also mentioned in the opening of this panel discussion. Now, if we zoom out to sort of a 10,000-foot level, it's important to recognize one of the greatest achievements in education over the last 50 years has been the significant increase in enrollment in primary education, including near, in most countries, equal access to boys and girls in primary education. However, this significant achievement in enrollment and access, at least in primary education, has not correlated to equal levels of learning. That is, not although more and more children today are attending school or accessing school globally, that we have not seen, unfortunately, the same level of success in having all children achieve learning levels. And marginalized children in particular in each context face significant challenges, and both in the access but also in the quality of the education that inhibits this acquisition of learning levels. You can see from this snapshot of called the global learning crisis that it's obviously with these type of statistics and this type of situation globally, it's curtailing the potential of education has to influence and promote social justice. And I just encourage you to skim through some of these key statistics, recognizing time is limited. I won't go through them, but just the point being that the current levels of, although, as I mentioned, when the great success is improving access, looking at marginalization and disparities, as you mentioned at the opening of this panel, but also some of these key statistics on levels of access and levels of learning, the influence education has on social justice and promotion of social justice and social cohesion, and enabling the full realization of right of every child education is curtailed and constrained. One of the key issues is related to understanding the why, and therefore what can be done to address and to promote the realization of the human right of every child to education around the world, is when you compare is the funding. But if you look at the disparities globally between high-income countries and low-income countries, both in the years of schooling on average, the investment that is placed between low-income countries globally on average and high-income countries on average, and the resulting learning levels. You can see this one dimension, but looking at on average, the situation and the level of realization of the right to education in low-income countries compared to high-income countries needs to be addressed. And just to elaborate further on that, as you move, I think it's helpful to take a snapshot also of follow a child along the learning journey. And here's just some key snapshots of kind of key points of the transition. The percentage of children that are school ready as at age 5 or often 6 in most countries. 3/4 of children are developmentally on track, as in school ready when they enter the school. However, then you can see as at 10, 11, 12, roughly, when key moment in their learning journey in which a child transitions from learning to read to reading to learn, meaning they need the foundational levels of learning to be successful in schools, where only half of the children can read and comprehend a simple text globally at that stage on average. At age 15, as they continue, only 3 out of 10 have a full range of secondary level skills, and then further as the further diminishes the full range of skills in order to access and realize their potential and employment and engagement. Let me just come back to expenditures and resources. And if you look at over the last 20 years, comparing high income and upper middle, lower middle, and lower income countries, in this slide here, you can see the significant, not only, first of all, the differences, as I mentioned before, in high income countries on average compared to per child expenditure compared to low income countries, but the trends also are showing a further increase in the divide between children living in high income countries and children living in low income countries, and levels of resources that are available, public resources. This also then is exacerbated when you're looking at the percentage of expenditures or investment that households make. It's higher in terms of percentage of the total resources of the household in low-income countries to realize the access and enable children to attend school as compared to high-income countries. So you have a lower level of public resources from governments and others, but also a higher percentage of household income is being allocated to enable the children to access in low-income countries. Again, further exacerbating the disparities that exist, and then further curtailing and constraining the impact education has on social justice around the world. So to conclude, for education to realize its full potential to promote social justice, disparities, as I mentioned, globally around those dimensions in both access and also quality of education need to be urgently addressed. So all children, as per the definition of social justice, all children have the right to education. Greater efficiency and effectiveness, but also an increase in overall public resources in education is critical, and a narrowing of those divides between high-income and low-income countries by increasing investment and support to low-income countries. And it's important to also look at what is taught, and also how the pedagogy are also very important components within the school itself, as the opening presentation also mentioned, to ensure that every child also can benefit and can realize their right to education in a socially just education system. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins, for your presentation. It was great to hear that the important factors that impacts the social justice and education. So we will start with the second part of the panel, but before that, I'd like to summarize what you said so far. So from the Asian perspective, we saw that the diversity, equity, and inclusion is starting to evolve there, like trying to be a significant part in the university section, and they have still more to do for better implementations. And from the presentation from Dr. Lahmar, I heard that the ethical accountability is very important for educational systems, because if you don't have the ethical information or teachings or components in your education, so the education may have bad impacts on other people as well, like as we see in Gaza. And from the presentation of Dr. Jenkins, we saw that many components of in the education system may impact the social justice, and we have like income factor and teacher factor and other factors that may impact the education, and the education impacts the social justice as well. So those that I noted from your presentations. So I will start from Dr. Kennedy, and I have a couple of questions for each presenter, and then I will have your last words at the end. And I will start with Dr. Kennedy. I have two questions for you. In terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, could you provide any more concrete examples from Asian universities that might be like good examples, or might be like bad examples that you may have seen or encountered in the universities?
Yes, thank you for that. It's a good question. We did find across most of the universities there is a commitment to one or other of those three elements. And there are officers that attempt to deal with the issues that confront students. And so we think that's a good thing. And as you quite rightly said, this is an emerging area for many universities in the region. And what we would like to do is to, if you like, promote these very good practices that are starting, and let everyone know, particularly what's happening in other universities, so that the good practices can be picked up. That I think is the most important finding. I think another is equity, and this is quite controversial in the sense that when we looked at Vietnam and China and found that ethnic minority students were given extra points that enable them to enter university. At the same time, we find that that practice is not fully supported, particularly by other students. Local students who expect to have a right to enter universities but don't get the extra points. And so, on the one hand, we think the extra points is a really good example of equity, but it actually does create some community problems in terms of how you then define fairness. And in a and I think what we would say in a Western sense, even people find problems with that definition. And that's the problem in the United States at the moment, that when initiatives are put in place that favor one group over another, and these are classified as equity, then the implications of the community understanding those issues is significant, we think. So that we think is an issue that deserves a lot more debate and discussion than it currently has, because we think, yes, to us it looks okay, but it doesn't look okay to the local communities. And so we need to work out how to get a greater understanding of treating all students in ways that provide them with an equal start, as distinct from letting people suffer from the disadvantage that they have. I think going forward, that's going to be a very big issue.
Okay. And do you have like any recommendations for the universities in Asia in terms of like improving or enhancing the situation for diversity or social justice, let's say? Any?
Yes, we do. We think, and we recommend that university leaders in particular, our project is actually concerned with leadership and how university leaders can focus on DEI. We believe that leaders need to become committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and lead their institutions with policies in particular that will send a very strong signal that treating people, recognizing diversity, treating people equally and fairly, and making the university environment one that is welcoming to all students ought to be everyday practice across Asian universities. And our recommendation is that leaders need to take this up. It should not just be the initiative of one committed individual. It needs to be part of university culture rather than depending on one person or another to do it, maybe in their class, maybe with their students, rather than with the whole of the university. So we're going to place, rightly or wrongly, a lot of faith in leadership to make things better.
Great. And do you have any last words that you want to share with us?
Just in general, I would think the really interesting thing that emerges from all the presentations, but particularly those of Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Lamar, is how do we deal with the macro issues that both presentations raised, in the sense that they are issues way beyond individuals. Because as individuals, we can do a lot, but we can't address those very big issues like the discrepancies that Dr. Jenkins points out between the simple income discrepancies, the years of schooling discrepancies that were pointed out, the way in which, in terms of Dr. Lamar's presentation, some groups of people are not just disadvantaged, but openly discriminated against. How do we deal with those very big issues? I think this has to be an agenda for the future that is not just to put it off, but to make sure that it gets addressed by those people who can most address it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I will continue with Dr. Lahmar. It was a great presentation, Dr. Lahmar, and I have a couple of questions for you. From the human rights perspective, how do you think we should integrate ethical accountability into the education for global education system, let's say? How do you think?
Thank you. It's such a big and complex question to answer, as Professor Kerry just mentioned. To think about as educators, to really tackle the everyday, because if policymakers are listening to us, we call them actually to question those kind of collaborations they make, because when universities, for example, try to go and higher in the ranks in the system, then they will go to do more research collaborations with some institutions to gain more of kind of points for the ranking, and that is supporting the systemic inequity in ways by enabling this oppression within the system. So is something that is a call for both the global north and global south, the educators, policymakers, and also practitioners on the ground. Practitioners on the ground, for example, in the colonized nations who are now in their independence, but independence is more than the independence of land, is also the independence of thought, as Fanon and Benebi and Paulo Freire and others mentioned, is actually to go in the pedagogy, like Professor Robert just mentioned when he raised what is showing both what is taught and how is taught. And this is for practitioners, and for something that educators can do in the classroom is the pedagogies we ask from the curriculum content to the pedagogies that we use, to the assessment that we use, to the feedback that we give to the students. When students are alienated as from their own heritage, in their own countries, in their own localities, to respond to international assessments like PISA, for example, then they live within their own context, alienated because their knowledge, indigenous knowledge, indigenous pedagogies are ignored, are dealt with as inferior, and that has impact on their identity and also on their creativity and their innovation of who they are. And we can see many theorists who discuss this, and critical pedagogy, for example, is in a way to bring that the indigenous knowledge into practice. So storytelling, for example, many nations, they are more of that's oral tradition. That is embedded pedagogies within certain cultures that the ancestors bring, but they are ignored within a system that was kind of adopted and brought from outside to other cultures, and they have to alienate themselves and who they are in order to respond to something that's brought from outside. I'm not saying ignore that and don't benefit from other nations. No, we are in a global and we are interconnected humanity, and we need the expertise, but also we need to respect and dignify the self within those local, and not deal with as inferior, but deal as an exchange of expertise and exchange of knowledge with respect and dignity. So I hope this answers. It goes under practice, on everyday practice, and also it goes into the curriculum content, it goes the policy making, and it goes into the ethical collaborations. I'm here in the universities. My past university is actually having collaborations with this, and what is important are the metrics. So the message we are passing to, if we are producing, and I'm saying it, producing students, scholars who don't think ethically, I think this is a danger for all humanity.
Yeah, it's very important.
Thank you.
Actually, and I have another question for you, or I just want to have your comment about that. What would be your message to the world about the current situation in Gaza as an human, as an educator?
let us talk about as a human being. I think the reason I raise this is if education doesn't preserve the human compassion, then as educators we are failing. We are failing ourselves. We are failing humanity. And if we don't look and don't see what's going on in Gaza, when we see as educators the educational infrastructure has been demolished, and that the history and the heritage and all that consequences that come with it, and then yet we celebrate some institutions for contributing to this. The qualification they get, they have more reputation, and therefore the students who qualify from those highly ranked universities, they get better jobs. And those universities, those people who are resilient in Gaza, those people who are struggling every day to keep their education, are missed from all that, and they are, they are excluded in every way. So my message is, let us be human. Let us really think how can we support those children and those learners at all stages, and those educators as academics. We have colleagues there who have been assassinated, who have been targeted for who they are being of their scholarship. So let us do something. Contribute with what we can, raise awareness or contribute to teaching. And there is a lot of initiatives of teaching online, but is a problem of internet. So we have to really think what kind of initiative I do forward, not because they are Palestinians per se, because they are human beings like us, and they deserve the dignity and they deserve the life that we are living in other places in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, and I strongly agree with all of your comments. And what will be your last words before I go for Dr. Jenkins? Okay, last word. What will be your last words, Dr. Lahmar?
The last words I would say, we really need, if we are not ethical educators, if we are not really thinking deeply about our ethics, I think education, if we buy the neoliberal kind of framework of education, means success is how much I produce economically, we are failing education for humanity, and we are heading towards a dangerous competitive ending. And I think we need to question this deeply when we in every practice of our, in any position that we are in. I'm not saying the economy is important, but more important than economy is being human and serve the compassion and dignity of being human.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Jenkins, I have a couple of questions for you as well. You mentioned many factors that may impact the education system and diversity, inclusion, and equity. What do you think about which of the factors is impacting the most, and why do you think?
Well, I think it's a good question. As I mentioned, I think we need to look at the level of access children have around the world to schooling. We need to look at the content of that, what's being taught and how it's being taught. And to enable that, we need to focus on the most marginalized, reduce disparities. I think probably the number one issue, and as you raised it in your opening presentation too, is the level of support to teachers to enable them to reach children and reach each child where they are on their learning journey, as I mentioned before, and reach them in a holistic way, because we also recognize children are not only about learning, they have holistic needs, and therefore, and many children of school age, school plays the most significant part of the child's life in interaction with public services. So leveraging the supporting teachers, leveraging the school as a platform for comprehensive support to meet the holistic needs of children in order to reduce the disparities and marginalization of children in various countries and globally, I think is the number one priority that moving forward.
Okay, thank you. And now I have another question. What do you think about the future of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then social justice and education? What will be the future?
Well, again, I think for education to realize its full potential to promote social justice and it will need to enable access for all. We'll need to improve the quality of education so that children can realize their full potential. I think the pedagogy and how schooling is delivered in an engaging way that encourages critical thinking and meets children in their with their individual and specific needs, that will then enable all children to contribute to their full potential in a socially cohesive way. And then I think you have communities, countries, and the world sort of, in a sense, realizing and addressing the key challenges that we have currently, including climate change related, and as I mentioned earlier, breaking cycles of poverty, all sort of these fundamental challenges that we have. All roads lead back to the potential of education systems to realize the right of every child to education.
And what will be your last words for the class?
Well, I think we recognize as parents how important education is to our own children. I think taking a more collective, broader view, recognizing that all children have right to education and therefore to reflect that in the allocation of public expenditures, to reflect that in international development assistance to the global South, so that, again, all children have a right to education, I think should be a responsibility for all of us moving forward.
Thank you very much. It was great to have an exchange of thoughts and discussion with you, all of you, and thank you very much for being with us today from different sides of the world. So thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to really extend my gratitude to our moderator and our esteemed panelists for that insightful discussion. Thank you very much for joining us at the 4th Istanbul Education Summit. Much appreciated.